Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to join in the debate about Bill C-23, an act respecting the pre-clearance of persons and goods in Canada and the United States. The bill would modify the legislative framework governing pre-clearance operations, the process that allows people traveling from Canada to the U.S. to go through American customs and immigration procedures while still on Canadian soil. This currently exists at 8 Canadian airports, and as anyone who has taken advantage of it is aware, it makes travel to the United States much faster and more convenient. With C-23 in place, it will be possible to expand pre-clearance to new locations and modes of transportation, to implement cargo pre-clearance, and to establish for the first time Canadian pre-clearance operations in the United States. This entails substantial advantages for Canadian travelers and for the Canadian economy. Certain members have raised concerns about the bill and new legislative framework it will create. And that's obviously fine. Each of us has the responsibility as members of Parliament to scrutinize legislation and bring any potential issues to the House attention. But we also have the responsibility to avoid exaggerated statements and keep our analysis tethered to the facts. Unfortunately, certain critics of C-23, and in particular the NDP candidate for Ottawa-Vanier, have been, and I assume unintentionally, making blatantly incorrect assertions about the bill, and it's important to set the record straight. To begin, that candidate has written that Bill C-23 will allow American border security officers to arrest Canadians on Canadian soil. This is completely wrong. Under this legislation, U.S. officers will have no powers of arrest whatsoever. She has also written that C-23 will allow U.S. pre-clearance officers to detain, question, seize property, frisk, strip search, and arrest Canadian citizens on Canadian soil. Once again, this claim about powers of arrest is simply fictional. As for the first 4 items in that list, U.S. officers have already had those authorities for decades. In fact, during the debate, NDP members have been calling for the current framework to remain in place. While the current framework empowers U.S. officers to detain, question, seize property, and frisk Canadian citizens on Canadian soil, it seems worth asking whether the NDP candidate in Ottawa-Vanier considers her own party's position in favor of the current pre-clearance arrangement to be an affront to Canadian sovereignty. And with respect to searches, the current framework allows U.S. pre-clearance officers to detain a traveler for the purpose of search and requires them to request a Canadian officer to conduct the search. This remains in the case in C-23. The only change is that in the exceptional circumstance that a Canadian officer is unavailable, the U.S. officer would be allowed to conduct the search themselves. If the NDP considers this a bridge too far, they are free to make that argument, but I think most Canadians will rightly see this is a minor adjustment that it is. On the subject of travelers who enter a pre-clearance area, then change their mind and decide to withdraw, the NDP candidate has written, there is no escape. And she claims U.S. officers would have all the power they need to hold anyone they want. The reality is that travelers would be free to withdraw from a pre-clearance just as they are now. Bill C-23 merely adds that withdrawing travelers may have to say who they are and why they're leaving in order to guard against people probing the pre-clearance area for security weaknesses. Moreover, is already the case under existing law. Anyone detained by a U.S. pre-clearance officer must be transferred to Canadian authorities as soon as possible. She has also written that C-23 would protect U.S. pre-clearance officers who abuse their powers for all prosecution. Once more, this is just plain false. The new pre-clearance agreement with the United States, the one being implemented by the bill, establishes a fully reciprocal framework for shared criminal jurisdiction. The U.S. would have primary jurisdiction over most acts committed by its officers in the course of their duties, just as Canada would have primary jurisdiction over most criminal offenses committed by our officers in the United States. The host country would retain primary jurisdiction for most serious offenses, as well as any offense committed by an officer while off duty. With respect to civil action, C-23 maintains the existing rules. As is current the case, a traveler who feels they have been mistreated couldn't sue an individual officer, but they could sue the U.S. government, and the same would apply in reverse for the Canadian operations on American soil. In all circumstances, American pre-clearance officers operating in Canada would be required to comply with Canadian law, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. The more we expand pre-clearance, the more Canadian travelers can undergo U.S. border procedures while protecting by Canadian law and the Canadian Constitution. The alternative is for Canadian travelers to be searched and questioned in the United States with none of these safeguards. Finally, the NDP candidate in Ottawa Vanier has written that C-23 threatens the rights of permanent residents of Canada to be able to return home from abroad. This is once again incorrect. There is absolutely nothing in this bill that will prevent permanent residents from returning to Canada. Her assertions seem to be a reference to the unlikely confluence of multiple hypotheticals that could result in a person with major admissibility issues having to return to Canada the usual way, rather than go through the pre-clearance in the event that Canada established pre-clearance operations in the U.S., and in the event that a permanent resident of Canada develops a major admissibility issue, such as committing a serious crime, and in the event that a person is nevertheless allowed into the United States, such a person may have to re-enter Canada through the ordinary port of entry, rather than benefiting from the pre-clearance simply because pre-clearance officers may not be equipped to deal with that particular situation. Now, the NDP is free to argue that this is a quadruple hypothetical whereby a person with a record of serious criminality would be inconvenienced is a good reason to deny millions of Canadians the advantage of expanded pre-clearance. But, Mr. Speaker, I strongly disagree. And that's the heart of the issue here. Do the concerns raised by the NDP justify saying no thanks to the huge upside of pre-clearance expansion? It seems quite clear to me that they don't. The changes that would be made by C-23 to the legislative framework governing pre-clearance are moderate and reasonable, and they would pave the way for substantial benefits. Benefits such as reducing congestions to 12 million passengers per year. Benefits such as 2015, where Canada exported over $400 billion worth of goods and services. Benefits of $50 million in services to the United States. Benefits of 600,000 jobs. Benefits of tourism and activities. We're talking about reducing hassles and delays for Canadian travelers, making it more convenient for tourists and business travelers to come to Canada, and making it quicker and easier for Canadian businesses to ship goods to and from the United States. Bill C-23 will be good for travelers, good for business, and a major step forward for Canadian economy. I invite all the honourable members to engage in thoughtful, informed discussion of this legislation both today and hopefully at the committee. And I certainly intend to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.